In this presentation, you will learn about Goffman and dramaturgical perspective. Irving Goffman is often regarded as a prominent 20th century microsociologist. Between the 1950s and 70s, Goffman authored a series of books and essays that gave birth to dramaturgical analysis as a form of symbolic interactionism. Goffman's The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, written in 1959, is a key work in the symbolic interactionist paradigm that provides a detailed description and analysis of process and meaning in daily routine interactions. Through a micro-sociological analysis, Goffman explores the details of individual identity, group relations, the impact of environment, and the movement and interactive meaning of information. His perspective, though limited in scope, provides new insight into the nature of social interaction and the psychology of the individuals. Goffman's sense of the self was formed by his dramaturgical approach. To Goffman, like Mead and other symbolic interactionists, the self is not an organic thing that has a specific location. In analyzing the self, then, we are drawn from its processor, from the person who will profit or lose most by it, for he and his body merely provide the peg on which something of collaborative manufacture will be hung for a time. The means of producing and maintaining selves do not reside inside the peg. Dramaturgical analysis is clearly consistent with its symbolic interactionist roots. It has a focus on actors, action, and interaction. Goffman, in his dramaturgical analysis, has used the metaphor of theater to explain small scale social processes. Goffman's conception of the self is influenced by Mead's ideas, especially his discussion of the tension between the I and the me. The tension is due to the disparity between what people expect us to do and what we may want to do spontaneously. We are expected to act in a manner that others see as appropriate behavior in a particular situation, and we are not expected to deviate. As Goffman put it, we must not be subject to ups and downs. Individuals, to project a stable self image, perform and act for their audiences. In interaction, they attempt to manage the image they present. Social behavior is thus similar to theatrical performances. Goffman saw much in common between theatrical performances and the kinds of acts we all put on in our day to day actions and interactions. Goffman uses terms like script, audience, identity kits, performance, props, and other theoretical references. By utilizing the language of drama, Goffman has provided an insightful account of the presentation of self in everyday life. Interaction is seen as very fragile, maintained by social performers. The self is the product of dramatic interaction that might be disrupted during the performance. Poor performances or disruptions are seen as great threats to social interaction, just as they are to theatrical performances. The dramaturgical approach is concerned with the processes by which such disturbances are prevented. When individuals interact, they engage in impression management, the techniques actors use to maintain specific impressions, problems they are likely to encounter, and methods they employ to cope with these problems. When individuals interact, they want to present a certain sense of self that others will accept. However, as they present themselves, they are aware that members of the audience can disturb their performance. The actors hope that the sense of self that they present to the audience will be strong enough for the audience to define the actors as the actors want. The actors also hope that this will cause the audience to act voluntarily as the actors want them to. Using his theatrical analogy, Goffman claims that social life is a performance carried out by teams of participants in the front stage, backstage, and offstage. In all social interaction, there is a front region which is similar to the stage front in a theatrical performance. Actors both on the stage and in social life are seen as being interested in appearances, wearing costumes, and using props. Examples of front stage behavior include the everyday routines of people's daily lives, like shopping, going to work, students' behavior in the classroom, etc. Front stage is that part of the performance that functions in rather fixed and general ways to define the situation for those who observe the performance. Within the front stage, Goffman further distinguished between the setting and the personal front. The setting refers to the actual scene that must be present if the actors are to perform, without which they cannot perform. For example, the taxi driver, a cab, for an ice skater, ice. The personal front consists of those items that the audience identifies with the performers and expects them to carry with them into the setting. The personal front is subdivided into appearance and manner that is expected to be consistent with each other. Appearance refers to the items that tell us the performer's social status, and the manner tells us about the role the performer expects to play in the situation. Individuals attempt to create an idealized image of themselves in the front stage and conceal certain truths about themselves that are incompatible with their performance. For example, drinking alcohol. It may be necessary for actors to hide from the audience the work involved in making of the final product. They may simply show only the end result, concealing the process involved in it. An important aspect of dramaturgy in the front stage is that actors often try to convey the impression that they are closer to the audience than they actually are, and convey that the present performance is the most important one. To do this, the actors ensure that their audiences are segregated so that the falsity of the performance is not known, and even if it is known, the audiences may try to cope with the falsity so as not to shatter the idealized image of the actor. The actor, through the performance, conveys the impression that there is something unique about this performance, as well as his or her relationship to the audience. Actors try to ensure that all parts of performance blend together. A single slip on the part of the actor can disrupt the performance that may damage the overall performance greatly. For example, a slip by the priest on a sacred occasion could be more disruptive than a taxi driver taking a wrong turn. Goffman also discussed the backstage, the stage where facts are suppressed in the front or the kinds of informal actions may appear. It is cut off from the front stage. Backstage is a place where the impression fostered by the performance is knowingly contradicted as a matter of course. Backstage means how people act when they are relaxed or unobserved. There is no need for any kind of impression management, and people can step out of character, shed their roles, and be themselves. For example, when we are with our friends, we behave in a more relaxed manner. We are off stage, unobserved, and thus more relaxed. The stage thus becomes a metaphor where we act in ways that fulfill our need to be accepted in society. There is also the off stage, the outside that is neither front or back. No area can be one of these three dimensions. A given area can also occupy all three domains at different times. For example, a professor's office is front stage when a student visits, is backstage when the student leaves the office, and is outside when the professor is at the marketplace. Maintaining the separation of front and backstage is important for impression management. It can be found in all areas of social life. However, this distinction can also break down, resulting in embarrassment, undermining the credibility of the previous performance. Whether effective or not, impression management involves an audience that also has a stake in ensuring successful performance. Sometimes, when performance goes wrong, the audience may attempt to save the day by providing excuses for the untoward behavior. However, as Goffman demonstrates in Asylums and Stigma, there are situations where audience makes the effective performance of a role difficult. Asylums. Essays on the social situation of mental patients and other inmates. In this controversial work, through his four essays, Goffman provides a powerful analysis of the significance of social structure in producing conforming behavior, especially in environments that Goffman labeled total institutions, such as mental asylums, prisons, and military establishments. Goffman saw total institutions as a forcing house for changing persons as a natural experiment on what can be done to the self. Total institutions are those social settings in which every aspect of the inmates is dictated and controlled. A chief concern is to develop a sociological version of the structure of the self. In the total institution, the inmate is separated from ordinary collaborators and engages with a staff that requires different terms of collaboration. Inmates are exposed to a series of humiliations, degradations, and profanations of themselves and a withdrawal of all the physical and social supports that once supported them. The inmates may experience what Goffman calls a mortification of the self. Total institutions impose such regimentation often with the purpose of a radical resocialization, changing an inmate's sense of self through deliberate manipulation of the environment. The power of a total institution to resocialize is also enhanced by its forcible segregation of inmates from the outside by means of physical barriers such as walls and fences topped with barbed wires and guard towers, barred windows, and locked doors. Cut off in this way, the inmate's entire world can be manipulated by the administrative staff to achieve long term reform or at least immediate compliance in the inmate. This process is carried in the name of God, country, justice, or cure. Goffman does not object to this. However, he describes the self's resistance to its stripping. The self resists this change and struggles against its transformation, perversely insisting on retaining some portion of its familiar substance. He points out that inmates engage in secondary adjustments that do not directly contradict the staff of the total institution, but they assert that they are still their own persons with some influence and control over their surroundings, control that is independent of God, country, or party. In characterizing the self struggle, Goffman employs a number of phrases: expressed distance, holding off from fully embracing all the self, I implications of its affiliation, etc. He believes that without something to belong to, one cannot have a stable self, and yet total commitment and attachment to any social unit implies a kind of selflessness. As a result, one's sense of being a person can come from being drawn into a wider social unit. Our sense of selfhood can arise through the little ways in which we resist the pull. Stigma: Notes on the Management of Spoiled Identity. In his dramaturgical approach in the presentation of self in everyday life, Goffman suggests that the performer has extensive control over the image of the self, but in stigma, this control is compromised. Take, for example, the dwarf, disfigured, alcoholic, imprisoned, homosexual, or the stigma of race, nation, and religion. There is a gap between the virtual identity and the actual social identity. Virtual identity refers to what an individual is intended to be in the eyes of others, and actual identity is the attributes an individual can be proved to possess. Social identity is spoiled when there is a difference between the virtual and the actual identity, as is often the case for individuals with stigma. Many normals believe that the person with stigma is not quite human and will practice various forms of discrimination that reduces the life chances of the stigmatized individuals. The stigmatized individuals also hold the same belief about their identity as the normals. As a result, the stigmatized perceive themselves as that whatever other profess, they do not really accept him and are not ready to make contact with him on equal grounds. In stigma, Goffman focuses primarily on the information the stigmatized convey about themselves in mixed contacts with normals, on their attempt to project or protect the self they believe they have, and on how we normals respond to their discredited features and encourage their adoption of a good adjustment. In his book, Goffman studies various situations in which he examines a person's feelings about himself and his relationship to people whom society calls normal. The term stigma describes the situation of the individual who is disqualified from full social acceptance. Goffman argues that stigma is closely linked with stereotype, and both these are related to the unconscious expectations and norms that govern social interactions. Critique of Goffman. Critics of Goffman approach makes some similar points to those leveled at other microsociologists. Perhaps he does not give enough recognition to the role that power plays in structuring social relations, tending to understand interactions from the participant's point of view. The dramaturgical analogy can also be questioned. This may be a good model for studies of organizations and total institutions, but may not be so effective in other social settings. Similarly, Goffman's theatrical analogy works best in modern Western societies that have established a distinction between the public and the private spheres of life, the front and back stages. But in other societies, this division is either less evident or just does not exist in the same form. His writings are often criticized for the subjectivist approach that defies objectification and verification. Contemporary significance. Goffman's work has had a profound influence not only on sociology as a discipline, but on numerous scholars who have been inspired to become professional sociologists as a result of reading his writings. He is widely regarded as having made some of the most thoughtful and stimulating contributions to the discipline. Many sociologists still refer to his original writings, for example, of how to conduct microsociological research, and the concepts he developed have become part of the very fabric of sociology in a variety of fields. Thank you for watching the presentation.